And I'm just going to present, um, thank you, a few slides to introduce us, kind of set the stage for the shared Arctic variables. Just to give you a little bit of background on kind of where we're at with this SAON roadmap for observing and data systems process, or the ROADS process. I do want to acknowledge we have an ever-evolving SAON ROADS advisory panel. We've got representation from a variety of Indigenous groups. We want to note that we're always open and welcome, currently recruiting for additional Indigenous participation. And you can contact myself or Sandy Starkweather, our other co-chair for this advisory panel, with more information on how to become involved with our advisory panel. But we do have quite a diversity across our advisory panel as far as representation and expertise. And so kind of why roads? Just to set the stage, SAON, sustaining Arctic observing networks, was created in 2011 as part of a joint initiative between IASC and the Arctic Council, set to improve and integrate Arctic observing and data systems. It does engage Arctic, non-Arctic, permanent participant working groups and organizations that are observing the Arctic system. And this is, again, quite diverse in participation. But as of 2018, we didn't really have a systematic mechanism to how to link observing networks, existing efforts, and then deal with data system requirements, and kind of look at this as a cohesive strategy. Both the Arctic science ministers and Arctic observing, sorry, I'm trying to control my screen, summit, wanted SAON to become more active in this role in planning and implementation around observing and data systems. And so ROADS is coming through to kind of look at observing requirements, data system requirements, implementation strategies, and bring together this quite large and ever-growing networks to partner on this process. Part of this process, really important, is having these guiding principles. And so the SAON ROADS process is kind of grounded in 4 guiding principles. The first being equitable partnership and funding for Indigenous peoples. We recognize Indigenous peoples are critical, and equitable participation is going to result in the best process for this group. And so that's our first kind of guiding, grounding principle. The second is that all aspects of the ROADS process should support shared benefits. And so this idea of shared Arctic variables and multiple user groups benefiting from the work, from the observing, from the data systems that we're doing. Third, the ROADS process should complement and integrate current approaches and use the existing networks. Those are on the ground, local to regional, to Pan-Arctic, to global. All of the existing work that is being done should be leveraged into and complement and integrated into the ROADS process. And finally, our fourth guiding principle is that ROADS should support a stepwise development, but be flexible and be allowed to adapt and evolve. So have kind of an evolving structure that allows bottom-up identification of what we're going to focus on and how each one of those steps looks. This idea of the shared Arctic variable is a multi-component kind of variable. The first is Indigenous-led identification implementation. Again, critical capacity to assure that our ROADS outcomes are relevant to Arctic communities and that they're well linked to culturally informed practices, processes, and decision-making. Second is regionally identified science and decision-making needs. Again, these arise from the changes that we're seeing, all of the priorities that are being identified that are constantly kind of changing or shifting due to rapidly evolving systems, and being responsive again to our communities and partners. And then third is this essential variables of global networks. Okay, so we need high capacity partnerships. This is a large partnership, and we need to link the roads process, these Arctic focused themes into the global system. And I think I have one more. Oh, there we go. And so resulting in our shared Arctic variables. I believe I'll just show this slide, and I apologize. I have a very angry infant, so I might hand it back over to Alice. This is an ever evolving definition for us. This is something that is changing. So even this slide and these definitions are a little bit behind our most recent iteration of this, but that is a brief background, and I'll pause, stop sharing, and hand it back to Alice.
Thanks, Lauren. So I can pick up exactly where Lauren left off with an introduction to shared Arctic variables. Yes, we're now familiar with this diagram of shared Arctic variables linking community-based information needs, regional and scientific information needs, and then global and larger scale information providers. So the definition of a shared Arctic variable, as Lauren said, is and has been growing and being refined over time. But if we really break it down into its three components, the shared, the Arctic, and the variable, shared in this case, we mean is developed through a process of co-designed and sustained partnerships, where we're really looking at information needs where there's an intersection of different interests and different uses for observations. So you can think of this as like, it's only really worth doing the coordination in the cases where you actually need coordination between different groups. So Arctic, I think, is probably the most self-explanatory. I know there's a bunch of different definitions of what counts as Arctic, but we're taking a kind of broad view of that. And then the variable part of this, we're looking at observable phenomena. So this could be taken from a more scientific process perspective or in indigenous knowledge systems that are critical for characterizing a system and or its changes. So what we're looking for with variables is that they're specific enough that it's possible to define observing and data requirements and implementation strategies, but not so specific that the information loses potential value in its context. So for the visual learners in the group, what this means is that we're taking a bunch of different groups of information users. This might be scientists, it might be local and regional governments, it might be indigenous communities, bringing them to the table with observers. So that's maybe experts in community-based measurement, other scientists, operational agencies, more indigenous experts, and facilitating this conversation to find where there's shared need for information regarding some sort of observable. And what comes out of this will be a set of requirements, not necessarily one, this is how we observe this one thing, recognizing that these different information needs will have different requirements attached to them. So some things may be best addressed with satellite-based observation or in situ scientific measurements. Other things will be best addressed with indigenous knowledge. And part of the shared Arctic variable definition is recognizing that indigenous knowledge is an important observing approach, an important way of understanding that can be, or it is equivalent to, and often can be more appropriate than Western scientific approaches for a given context. And oops, sorry, I don't know why this went backwards. So each of these different approaches has pros and cons. Satellite-based observation are great for large-scale coverage, but sometimes they're difficult to interpret. In situ measurements, great for answering very specific questions of interest, but you're limited then in area coverage and your duration of measurement. Indigenous knowledge provides holistic understanding that predates modern monitoring, But there's going to be cases where the information is either not available or not appropriate to use. And so as an example, we can look at, say, coastline position as a potential shared Arctic variable. There's going to be information needs kind of coming from all of these different approaches that are going to be shared across different user groups. So satellite-based observations may be used for documenting large-scale erosion patterns relevant to coastal villages and how they're planning. State national agencies that are tasked with supporting erosion mitigation efforts are going to need these observations. Commercial interests and infrastructure in the area will also need these observations. In situ measurements, likewise, are going to have very specific uses. They can provide high spatial resolution and kind of on-demand observation. So this might be something like drone footage of a coastline. Really relevant for community planners, emergency and disaster response, environmental remediation efforts, things that really need the very localized information. But then Indigenous knowledge systems will have this kind of long-term understanding of what areas of coastline are prone to erosion. And that might be really relevant to deciding how and where to relocate villages or planning for new construction and infrastructure. So you can see how these different knowledge systems and different kind of sources of information cross different user groups. And so the whole idea with shared Arctic variables is that it's creating this platform, creating this table to bring all of these different groups together around a common theme. And so the way we get there is this expert panel process. And so Lauren needed to go before she could show, there's kind of a basket diagram that some people have seen. This is going to walk through that process. So the way and this is coming from the Arctic Observing Summit and the Rhodes Advisory Panel, have envisioned this process working, is that a core group of experts convene around a starting theme. This might be something like wildfires, it might be something like salmon. And they develop a proposal identifying potential shared Arctic variables, how information related to those shared Arctic variables could be used, and then potential members of an expert panel, expanding it out to something like a dozen people. This initial starting proposal is also going to address those core guiding principles that Lauren talked about, really making sure that, among other things, that Indigenous voices are centered throughout this process. So at this point, the kind of small core group starts working with the Rhodes Advisory Panel, who may suggest additional members to the expert panel, suggest additional directions to look, and also link up this core group with, say, other expert panels if there's overlapping or shared interest. At that point, we build out a bigger expert panel that includes more perspectives, more things that are maybe one step removed from this initial core theme, to identify or to kind of build out this full proposal for a shared Arctic variable. So this is really making sure we know where there's overlapping interest and information, defining these observing requirements for the different information needs, and again, working with the advisory panel throughout this process. At which point the proposal would then go out to a public review, recognizing that there's some parts of the observing community where you can just send an email and that's probably good enough, or you can send 24 emails and that's probably good enough. And there's other groups that we're going to have to make a really specific effort. And so that might be organizing workshops in particular Indigenous communities to make sure that relevant experts are consulted at this point in the process. The proposal is revised based on the broad community feedback and then moves into an implementation phase focused on getting commitments from observing agencies and developing the data set and observation asset search tools to reflect the shared Arctic variable. So this is a recommended process or a process as we have it envisioned, recognizing that circumstances may require deviation from the proposed model. This is what the advisory panel is there to do, is to work with expert panel groups, to work with projects, to make sure that we have a process that reflects the core guiding principles, but also is practical and feasible. So there is certainly opportunity to make the process work for you, work for your projects, in a learning process. And Arctic PASSION and then RNA CoObs are two efforts that are piloting this process at this point. And so I will, in a moment, pass it over to Michael to talk through how Arctic PASSION is making this work. But if you have kind of clarifying questions about shared Arctic variables, please just drop them in the chat box. And then we can also come back to kind of bigger questions after the presentations. All right. You should be able to screen if you'd like to.
So I'll try to share now, but I didn't quite get it. Do you want questions to be raised now, or?
If we have any,
later?
I think if we have any clarifying questions, they can go ahead and just go in the chat, and we'll save more questions for the end.
Okay. So let me. Okay. So yeah, this is about Arctic PASSION and the SAVs. I hope it will be a love story in the end. So Arctic PASSION is an EU-funded project which started in summer 2021. And let me just try to move my slides here. It's funded by the European Commission, and it's quite a large project. We have 35 partner organizations and 6 indigenous communities which are participating or co-creating and collaborating in this effort. The coordination is at the Alfred Wegener Institute in Bremerhaven, and the basic idea of the project, the overall objective, is to improve the Arctic observing system of systems on many levels. So this is just a brief run through our overall objectives. I will give you a brief insight into the project so that you better understand why and how we are tackling the shared Arctic variables as well. So co-creating a coherent, better integrated and more sustainable Pan-Arctic observing system of systems is our overall goal. Important aspects are a meaningful collaboration with the Arctic communities, indigenous peoples and organizations. We are aiming to expand monitoring capabilities, not only scientifically, but also through broad inclusion of indigenous knowledge and local knowledge. We aim at improving data interoperability and simplify access to data. The goal is, of course, to improve monitoring to support predictions, risk assessment, and better information for adaptation, mitigation, and sustainable development, and policy and decision-making, of course. 2 parts of this project deal with so-called Eurogeo pilot services, which we are supposed to develop. We have 8 of them. I will give you an insight soon, and they are related to the shared Arctic variables in some aspect. And the second goal is to support SAON to become a geo-initiative on the global scale and represent the Arctic observations there. Yes, initiating shared Arctic variable expert panels and developing SAVs in support of SAON's roads program is also part of our duty. I must say that when the call work was coming out, to which we applied with our concept, the shared Arctic variables were not yet existing. They were called essential Arctic variables and had a much more similar, let's say, shape or strategy to other essential variables like essential climate variables in comparison to the present shared Arctic variable concept, which made it difficult for us, and this is already part of our story, how we deal with it, because the development of the shared Arctic variable concept as part of roads has been a moving target for us to cope with, or something under development. So we have to adapt some of our ideas, and we did so. So just a very broad overview over the project structure. We have basically 3 pillars we are dealing with. The first pillar is dealing with actually strengthening core observing system elements like actual new observations, dealing with data, using models to support observational concepts, and to develop these services I mentioned before, the GeoPilot services. Then we have 1 pillar dealing with societal and societal aspects, decision-making support and such, including a societal benefit analysis, better international collaboration and policy and decision-making support, and a kind of synthesis pillar. Now, the shared Arctic variables work in our project is spread all across these parts, so it's a truly cross-sectoral activity. We have based our concept on SAON roads, as I said, and the Arctic Observing Summit, let's say, deliberations and discussions over the past years. And the basic idea for us, what we take from this development is that we are looking for a set of observables called shared Arctic variables, or shared Arctic variable sets, that can help tackling local or regional problems in a better way. And as was mentioned by Alice, and also before, it is of course based on science as well as indigenous and local knowledge. We do have strong Canadian partners in the project who support our activities also in this respect, and we collaborate closely with the US RNA CoObs project. We have identified 3 themes, overall themes, which we want to deal with for our shared Arctic variables. And these 3 themes are permafrost, or living on frozen ground, wildfires, and sea ice. Now, why did we pick these 3? This goes back to not only the fact that these are 3 very relevant, societally relevant topics, but also we decided we wanted to deal with shared Arctic variable themes where we have some expertise in our consortium. And this expertise comes from 3 of our pilot services we are developing, and I just quickly run through all of them. So 1 is dealing with an event database of community-based monitoring using oral histories, indigenous and local knowledge. This is done in very close collaboration and co-creation with 6 indigenous communities around the Arctic. We have 1 dealing with permafrost, Pan-Arctic requirement-driven permafrost service at AVI. This is 1 of the 3 which is collaborating with the shared Arctic variable themes. Then we have 1 which will be a platform to assess Arctic environmental data. The 4th one is a pilot service which is dealing with integrated fire risk management. And as you may imagine, this is another one which is closely collaborating with the shared Arctic variable theme wildfire. Then we have 1 which is also somewhat related on pollutant forecast service improvements, 1 on shipping safety in the Arctic seas. And here you also we also have a strong involvement in the shared Arctic variables work. And then the last one, the last 2 are 1 on noise pollution in Greenlandic waters and 1 on lake ice safety. Now, coming back to the shared Arctic variables, which gets support internally from these 3 of our 8 pilot services. This is a concept picture of how we envision the process and started the process in Arctic PASSION. We have our project here. We have created a task team made of several people inside the project, but also pulled in expertise from Sandy Starkweather, for example. We are in collaboration and interaction with Alice and people from the AOS to try to help us in defining those three themes. Here you see them. And sticking to the example of permafrost, what we are now in the process of doing is creating those expert panels, being involved in the approval process by the Roads Advisory Panel, which was mentioned before. And then we are currently putting together a list of external and internal experts, indigenous and local from indigenous and local communities, science and academia, and policy. And this process is to a strong part in co-creation with local people from the regions where we are placing our services in. So what is the process going on like? So we set up expert panels of up to 12 people. The development is done in dialogue with the SAON advisory panel. We have to assess questions like what are potential impacts, what is it to observe, what is required as a commitment for the observations. I mean, with we in this case, I mean each expert panel. These are the questions they deal with. The inclusion of different background, I already mentioned, and what may be also relevant in this context is to think about the costs. Of course, having an equitable involvement of people who come from local and indigenous communities means we have to pay them not only for travel, but also for the time they spend. So if we think about, for example, for 4 phases of this process, for each shared Arctic variable of approximately 20 to 40 hours spread over a certain amount of time, a few years, maybe 2 years or so, or 3 years. This would mean roughly something like 100,000 euro for each shared Arctic variable to spend on travel and compensation for work. Not necessarily for all experts. People with a science job may not need this, but all of this will need to be taken into account if you want to fund such an effort. The output, of course, would then be SAP proposals submitted, in our case, for review by the end of the project. Now, these 3 themes, what is the status of them? The one on permafrost, we just had very good meetings at the Arctic Circle Assembly. We have had participants from the Tuktoyaktuk community in northern Canada and from the Longyearbyen local government. It has been decided to run with 2, let's say, regional panels for the moment, to see how the different conditions are impacting the needs. And we are going forward with this, with the creation of the expert panels in these months as we are speaking. For the second theme, wildfires, it is clear why wildfires are relevant. Here also we have 2 regional areas for this theme, one in Finland and one in North America, led by AMAP and the FMI. I should have mentioned the permafrost one is led by SAOS, our partner in Svalbard. And these 2 regional expert panels, one of them in Finland just started already, co-funded by national Finnish money, and we are in contacts with Parks Canada and the Gwich'in Council International for launching the expert panel in North America. And then for the third one, which is sea ice, we have a very strong Canadian involvement here with our partners INA, University of Ottawa, and the Carleton University. And they are just now in the process of identifying the expert categories and reaching out to local communities and indigenous communities in the vicinity And then they also fortunately have some funding support envisioned in Canada. You may remember the numbers I said. 100,000 euro per shared Arctic variable is not a small money, and not easy to pay just from one project. So what is the legacy of the shared Arctic variables if you go through this process? Well, I think, as I mentioned already, that we are going to finish the identification for these 3 themes during the project. The expert panels will contribute also to, at a later stage, to identify stewards for carrying on shared Arctic variable relevant work after the project has ended. Of course, the further development of the SAVs and our experience with the SAV process will reach beyond our project duration. That is at least our goal. And we are convinced that shared Arctic variables and the entire process can play a significant role in guiding the development of a more useful Arctic observing system, plus have the potential to empower indigenous and local communities in raising their case towards those organizations which are planning Arctic and funding Arctic observations. I stop here. The timeline is too detailed to be of interest for you, and just would guide you to the Arctic Passion website if you are interested to learn more about shared Arctic variables work at Arctic Passion and our other activities. And then I'm stopping here.
Thank you. So I repeat, we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. Next up, we have Maureen Bierman, who's going to be talking, providing an update on the RNA CoObs project and its work towards shared Arctic variables.
Thanks, Alice. Hi, everybody. My name is Maureen Bierman. I am the project coordinator for the RNA CoObs project that stands for Research Networking Activities for Sustained Coordinated Observations of Arctic Change. Unfortunately, our PI, Hayo Eichen, was not able to be here today. We are both based at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. We do have a larger project team that is dispersed across the US and beyond. Some folks are here today. I see them in the audience, and Alice, of course, is also on our team. So I just want to recognize also their role in the project. We are an NSF-funded project. We started up in 2020, so we're in the midst of our 3rd year right now. And similar to Arctic Passion, as Michael was describing, when we submitted our proposal and ramped up our project, shared Arctic variables was still an emerging concept, and at the time of the proposal writing, the SAON roads process was still not fully formulated either. So we were taking a lot of kind of stabs in the dark in terms of what to anticipate with this project. And once we began it, we realized that actually accomplishing the goals of the project would require a different framework from what we had originally envisioned. So we had, initially thought through of this process of consulting with community members or local people and other stakeholders, alongside scientists, and developing some sort of concept of requirements that we would need to capture to create some sort of output tool that would be used. And it has become clearer over time that just the basic establishment of relationships is something that we need to focus on and think through in a different way because of the structures that we're working in with funding agencies and academia, the realities of working with folks who live in the Arctic. So we've sort of rearranged our project, reoriented our project around this broader vision of creating meaningful relationships with Indigenous peoples through the design of Arctic observing and observation systems. So this is our large goal that we're trying to help us to guide our work into the future. Our overall mission is to build a community of practice around Arctic observing that serves societal needs, demonstrates equitable practices, and adds shared value for pressing decision-making needs. And then lastly, we have these driving purposes below to show how collaborative efforts in Arctic observing from the local to the international scale can be put into action to support Indigenous community needs, to equitably face the challenges of environmental change, and to support Indigenous self-determination in the broader social context, societal context, for example, in policy making. One of the things that we really reshaped in our project structure was to develop an Indigenous liaison team that works with our project. So we have 3 Indigenous liaison team members that support our work and that work with us. One is Margaret Rudolph, who's here on this call. Her work really links science, Western scientific frameworks with the co-production processes and Indigenous knowledge. So kind of she serves as a boundary spanner is maybe the best terminology to describe the work. She helps us straddle these different frameworks with which we see the world and work with the world. We have Craig Chythlock, who is focused on building relationships with community members, and he's done this through work with the Food Security Working Group, now called the Food Sovereignty Working Group, which was established at AOS, I believe back in 2018. It was a couple of AOSs ago. So he's helped to foster relationships both through the Food Sovereignty Working Group and also with communities in the Arctic. And lastly, we have Victoria Bushman, who has worked to foster international partnerships and relationships. So we have this threefold Indigenous liaison team that's really helping us to keep Indigenous perspectives central to our work, to focus on issues of equity, and to make sure that we're not driving this too much from the science side without actually thinking through these broader, the real meaning behind these broader visions, missions, and purposes that I've just outlined. So we currently have 6 task teams that we are organizing our work around. These including equitable and co-produced processes. And this is really referring to our internal work, making sure that we're thinking through our own work in an equitable way, thinking through, we recognize we're not able to do true co-production of knowledge at this point because we didn't start at the beginning of the process or prior to the process with co-production. So we're trying to think about where along the scale we might be able to fall, what we can do to foster processes that are, more co-produced or more in line with co-production, and thinking through our internal RNA CoObs processes in a way that really takes equity into account. Thinking through observing and equity, and this really is referring to our broader observing system and the broader system of scientists and observers that we work with, and ensuring that they have the tools and knowledge to understand what co-production of knowledge means, what Indigenous knowledge means, what respectful working with communities means. Influencing systemic change in research. This relates to things like funding of community members. How do we do that? We oftentimes don't have mechanisms to fund folks that are, Arctic inhabitants, for example, that we might want to work with. So finding novel ways to do that, finding novel ways to reframe broader research processes in the future so that they can do co-production at an earlier stage in the research process, so that they're not playing catch up in the ways that we have. Networking and partnerships. This involves really documenting and tracking the existing Arctic observing network, and thinking through how we might be able to expand it and strengthen those connections into the future. Initiating a shared Arctic variable expert panel, and this is the one that we're all interested in today. And that one sort of speaks for itself, and I'll talk in a moment in a little bit more detail about what we're doing related this to specifically, but I do want to highlight that all of these items, all of the other task teams are really working in support of this shared Arctic variable expert panel as well. Building community relationships, strengthening our partnerships and networks, ensuring equity, ensuring funding opportunities, et cetera. These are all things that are really necessary foundations for us moving forward as we start to move into the expert panel building segment of our work. And lastly, and this is something that will really come down the line in our project, planning for an information portal. So again, our initial goal was that, or our initial vision when we were at the proposal writing stage was that we would be able to stand up something like this by the end of the project. And we've realized that the reality is, given all of the foundational work that we recognize needs to happen now, first, what we are going to aim to do is try to plan for how this might be developed down the line, possibly set up some sort of mock framework for this, but realizing that within the scope of this 5-year funded project, it's unlikely that that's achievable if we want to do it in a way that does aim to be equitable and to engage with the people that we need to engage with. So to get back a little bit to where we are with the Shared Arctic Variable Expert Panel, this presentation is going to be a bit shorter than Mikhail's, in part because our project is not quite as far along with the expert panels as Arctic PASSION has gotten. Our goal now is to potentially stand up 2 expert panels, or I should say expert panels around 2 themes, 2 distinct themes. One is salmon and fisheries, and the other is coastal erosion and extreme weather events. We've worked, our Indigenous liaison, Craig Chythlook, has worked pretty extensively to make connections with folks living in the Bristol Bay region and also in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta region in Alaska, around these issues of salmon and fisheries, with the recognition that central to all questions of folks and communities living there are decision-making issues, policy-making issues related to this. So we can't really think about the observations without also taking into account the decision-making context that they are embedded within. So we've gotten to the point where we're just about ready to move towards standing up these expert panels, either 1 or 2, possibly one that combines the 2 regional groups that I mentioned there, Bristol Bay and YK Delta, or 2 separate ones potentially, depending on the interest that we get of folks and how much their specific interests in this in salmon and fisheries are able to align around this as a shared Arctic variable. Our longer term goal then also is to set up an additional expert panel around coastal erosion and extreme weather events, again in Arctic Alaska. We have connections at the University of Fairbanks and other folks who've been doing kind of extensive work on this issue, working with communities in particular. And it's there's kind of a well-established enough work that we have contacts with around this, that we're hoping that this will be something that we can pursue into the future. Additional things that RNA CoObs does in support of expert panels and shared Arctic variables has been so far to work to stand up a few mock expert panels, both at AOS last year, AOS 2022, as well as at the recent Alaska Forum on the Environment, where we had a number of successful working groups who talked through expert panel building around I think a few different themes. Was with permafrost, there was fisheries, permafrost, and coastal and extreme events. So we've been able to really get a lot of input from communities and from scientists, from other observers, from agency members, from a wide variety of decision makers as well, on what an expert panel really could and should look like, or not, I shouldn't say what the expert panel itself should look like, but the process for actually creating one as well, because those are 2 distinct things that we're trying to work our way through, both how to create it and then what it should look like and how it should move forward with work. We are working to overcome some of these challenges, again, such as making sure we have the appropriate network, the appropriate people involved, appropriate support and funding and capacity for those that need to be involved, as well as clearly identified benefits for everyone involved, so that folks don't feel like this is just another thing that they're doing, with an unclear end goal, but that there is, some ways that it will benefit their communities into the future. That's been a real central discussion that's continuing to emerge in our project. Whoops. I have a final slide. Here it is. If you'd like to get in contact with our project, you can reach out to Hayo Aiken, who's our principal investigator, or myself. Our contacts are there, as well as our website, or any of our other project team members that you see here today. That's it. I'll turn it back over to you, Alice. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Maureen. So we'll go ahead and open up 2 questions at this point. Ekaterina, I think you've had your hand up if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. It says, thank you for inviting me. I'm speaking from Norway. It's very nice to see how you guys evolve with so many new projects now around. I was just wondering if you could share some experience in terms of how do you measure impact, or what's your performance indicators for your program with respect to the scare and fair principles, with respect to the future impact. Are you planning something measurable, or is you just define the benefits, or you have some key performance indicators to monitor during your program?
I can start with this one, and others may want to jump in with more information. This is largely up to the expert panels to define what is success, what is measurable, a measurable benefit in these areas. For each different variable, it's going to be a slightly different set of impacts. And so we can't necessarily set a one-size-fits-all metric for what is success. That said, there are kind of these widespread data standards, care and fair principles that you mentioned. And we do expect that every expert panel will at some point in the process have somebody who is extremely well-versed in the kind of data policy world involved to make sure that the standards that are put in place do reflect kind of best practices at this point.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, just to add on, Alice, it's what Alice said, and of course, as you may imagine, you have seen the thematic width of our project. In our case, there are different indicators for each of the different work packages. So if you look at the data, interoperability work, of course, fair and care is very important, but there are also other indicators which may come into play. And then this is very different from, let's say, work package 1, where we are implementing a distributed biological observing network for the Atlantic domain, very similar to what has been set up for the Pacific by Jackie Grabmeyer and the PAG. So these will yet have another performance indicator. So they are all different, but I fully agree with you that it's important to think about these things. And when it comes to the shared Arctic variables, yeah, it's what Alice said. I think the expert panels need to define themselves what is the most valuable output. I would personally think that one very important part would be, once the shared Arctic variable sets are defined by the expert panels, that then there is a clear, let's say, communication partner on the observing system side, and that is a general issue for all the improvement of the observing system towards a more useful system for the people living in the Arctic. So I think we need to establish communication channels which allow the communication of needs and necessities on the local scale to the people who are running the system or funding the system. And we have to think about, as communities all together, what could be the best way to do that. We need to know the perspectives from the indigenous communities or local municipalities and so on these issues. And that, I think, plays also into the shared Arctic variable work. So how do we get this funded and actually working so that it's beneficial for the people who developed it?
Thanks. So related to that, we have a question in the chat from Vanessa. So for Arctic Passion in particular, it's EU-funded projects with external funding contributions. How do they match in terms of governance? When the observing system will be established or the project terminated, have you already found possible solutions to get monitoring of SAVs funded?
Well, to the latter part, no. There is no established funding yet. This is part of our work that we will have to try to convince people. As you say, we only get money for a certain amount of time. In our case, it's running up to summer 2025. And then the things have to roll on their own. For the pilot services, for example, which is also something where we are very keen on having them continued in the future. Based on our developments, we already have contacts to some of the Copernicus centers, and some of the centers who are involved in the development of those pilot services are also planning to keep them alive. For example, this lake ice service in Finland. Yeah, so it depends on the different activities, but it's an important aspect to think about sustainable funding. And maybe just to add on, one part of our work is dealing with a societal benefit analysis. And we hope that the output from this analysis, which will have the pilot services and the shared Arctic variables as a focus activity, that these assessments may help in convincing governments actually to fund these long-term observing efforts, or the provision of data through these services.
Maureen?
Yeah, we have similar issues, obviously, with the RNA co-ops project as well. We are aim to get these EPs set up, and then it's very unclear what happens beyond the scope of our 5-year funded project. And that's one of the goals of our project, though, is to start to identify ways where there are structural hurdles that will prevent this work from being undertaken in the future, or to continue into the future. And my hope is that we would also be able to, potentially come up with some solutions or ways around this. So yeah, I don't have an answer for how we would fund something like this beyond our 5-year project, but we do aim to identify some of these structural issues in research and governance that could be overcome potentially following the project.
Yeah, and part of the part of the design of shared Arctic variables, by bringing these different information users and information providers together, is that there may be opportunities for things that don't necessarily need additional funding. If an observing agency that's already doing work in a space can make some slight modifications to how they're observing or how they're providing data or information products, they may be able to meet information needs that are currently unmet without necessarily adding additional funding lines. And so part of the goal of getting all of these different groups to the table together is to be able to make more efficient use of the resources that we already have. Do we have any other questions? While you're finding the raise your hand button, I will point a couple things. So I dropped 2 links in the chat box. So there are papers that go into all of the gory details on the SAON roads process, and then shared Arctic variables. So the links to those are in the chat. I would also invite everyone who is interested and going to be at or online for ASSW starting at the end of the week to join us on Friday. This is February 17th. From 2 to 6 p.m. Central Europe time, whatever that is for you, wherever you are, for a very substantial SAON roads meeting. So this is really digging into some of the process, some of the next steps in developing these shared Arctic variables. So if you're around, again, that is an open meeting. You're welcome to join us for that. And then the last thing that I will do is, if you do have any follow-up questions, or you think of your question 3 minutes from when we close the meeting, please feel free to just email me. I'm dropping my email in the chat box, and I can also make sure to direct it to whoever might have the best answers for you. And then the last announcement is that we have recorded this, and afterwards we'll be sure to share the recording with everyone who did register. And if you have other colleagues who may be interested in the recording, the registration link will be the registration form will be updated to link to the recording rather than the live session. So feel free to just send them the registration form so we know who's been interested. All right. Well, I don't see anyone else. Thank you, everyone who spoke. Thank you for everyone who joined us today. We really appreciate your interest.
Yeah, thanks a lot also from my side, and see some of you in Vienna, or maybe in at the ISAR 7 in Tokyo, where there will also be a special session on wildfires. So look out for that one, or have a look at our website to see the announcement, or drop me a line.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the remaining people may just be lurking in the background. Thanks, guys. I think this went really well. I'll have the recording to you shortly. But this was great. I feel
Great.
like I learned a lot.
Yeah, thanks. That was a nice initiative. And let's hope some people got interested in the further development of the SAVs, or maybe launching own ones even. That would be fantastic.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alice, for putting this together.
No, just, I mean, thinking
Okay.
about where we were this time last year before the AOS, like we've made an incredible amount of progress this year.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks
Yep.
to all of you.
Yeah, thanks. Bye all.
Bye.